The morning sun filtered through the greasy windows of Murphy's diner, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Harold sat in his usual corner booth, weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that had grown cold 20 minutes ago. At 76, his shoulders still carried the proud bearing of a Marine. Though time had etched deep lines around his eyes and silvered what remained of his hair, the diner buzzed with its typical Saturday morning crowd-truckers. Grabbing quick meals, families sharing pancakes, and retirees like Harold seeking familiar comfort. He came here every weekend since Martha passed, finding solace in the clatter of dishes and murmur of conversation that filled the silence his empty house couldn't chase away. The bell above the door chimed aggressively as 3 leather-clad bikers strutted in, their boots heavy against the floor. The largest one, a mountain of a man with arms covered in tattoos and a beard that reached his chest, surveyed the room with cold eyes. His name was Tank, and he'd earned that nickname through years of intimidating anyone who crossed his path. Tanks. Gaze settled on Harold's table, where a small American flag pin adorned the old man's worn baseball cap. Something about the sight irritated him, perhaps the quiet dignity Harold carried, or maybe the way other patrons glanced at the veteran with respectful nods. Tank had never served his country, had never put anything above his own desires, and the sight of someone who had somehow made him feel small. "Look what we got here, boys," Tank announced loudly, his voice cutting through the diner's comfortable atmosphere. An old soldier boy playing dress-up. He approached Harold's table with predatory confidence, his boots echoing with each step. "Hey, Grandpa, Vietnam was like 50 years ago. Time to let it go, don't you think?" Harold looked up slowly, his blue eyes meeting Tank's glare without flinching. He'd faced down enemy fire in the jungles of Southeast Asia, had watched good men die for principles Tank would never understand. A bully in a diner hardly registered as a threat, but the disrespect stung deeper than any physical wound could. "I was just enjoying my coffee," Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor of age. "No need for trouble." Tank laughed, a harsh sound that made nearby conversations falter. "Trouble? Old man, you're taking up space that paying customers could use. Maybe it's time you shuffled home to your rocking chair." He leaned closer, his breath reeking of stale beer and cigarettes. Nobody wants to look at some broken-down has-been pretending he's still relevant. The diner fell silent except for the sizzle of bacon on the grill. Other patrons shifted uncomfortably, but none moved to intervene. Fear held them back. Tank's reputation preceded him, and his friends flanked the booth like sentries. Harold's hands remained steady around his coffee cup, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the only victory would be proving you could still throw a punch at 76. "I'll finish my coffee and be on my way," he said with quiet dignity. "Damn right you will," Tank sneered, emboldened by the old man's apparent submission. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before—" The diner door burst open with such force that the bell nearly flew off its hinges. A young man in army dress uniform strode in, his bearing rigid with barely controlled fury. Captain Marcus Thompson had inherited his father's steel-gray eyes and unwavering moral compass, though Harold had no idea his son had witnessed the entire confrontation through the window. Marcus had been driving to surprise his father for his birthday when he'd spotted Harold through the diner window. He'd parked across the street, planning to observe his dad's morning routine with fond amusement, when he'd seen Tank's approach and heard every venomous word through the thin glass. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect. His uniform immaculate despite the early hour, Tank spun around, his bravado faltering slightly at the sight of military bearing that radiated competence and controlled power. "Just having a conversation with Grandpa here." "Nothing that concerns you, soldier boy." Marcus stepped closer, his movements precise and measured. "That Grandpa happens to be a decorated Marine veteran who earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star in Vietnam." His voice remained perfectly level, but each word hit like a hammer blow. "He was wounded 3 times defending the freedom that allows you to walk into this diner and act like a fool." The color drained from Tank's face as other patrons began to murmur among themselves. Several pulled out phones, sensing something significant unfolding. Furthermore, Marcus continued, his gaze never leaving Tank's eyes, is also my father, and I've been listening to you disrespect him for the past 5 minutes. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I suggest you reconsider your approach. Harold's eyes widened in recognition and surprise. He hadn't seen his son in months, their relationship strained by Harold's stubborn independence and Marcus's demanding military career. The last conversation had ended in harsh words about Harold's refusal to move to assisted living. Tank's friends suddenly found the floor fascinating, their earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. Tank himself seemed to shrink, his imposing frame diminishing under the combined weight of military authority and moral clarity. We didn't mean anything by it, Tank stammered, his voice losing its edge. Just joking around. Joking? Marcus's eyebrow arched dangerously. You think a man's service to his country is a joke? You think age and sacrifice are subjects for humor? He stepped aside and gestured toward the door. I think you gentlemen have somewhere else to be. Tank nodded frantically, his earlier swagger replaced by desperate retreat. Yeah, we should go. He turned to Harold, his voice barely above a whisper. Sorry about what I said. As the bikers fled, the diner erupted in spontaneous applause. Patrons approached Harold's table, shaking his hand and thanking him for his service, their eyes bright with newfound respect and shame for their earlier inaction. Marcus slid into the booth across from his father, his uniform pristine despite the emotional intensity of the moment. Father and son studied each other across the scarred Formica table, years of unspoken hurt and love hanging between them like morning fog. You didn't have to do that, Harold said finally, though his voice carried gratitude instead of criticism. Yes, I did, Marcus replied firmly. I should have done it years ago, should have told you every day how proud I am to be your son. He reached across the table, covering his father's weathered hand with his own. I'm sorry, Dad. Sorry for the arguments. Sorry for trying to put you away. Sorry for not seeing that your independence isn't stubbornness. It's courage. Harold's eyes misted as he squeezed his son's hand. I'm proud of you too, Marcus. Prouder than you'll ever know, he paused, managing a small smile. Though I was handling things just fine on my own. Marcus chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. I know you were, Dad. You always have. He signaled the waitress for coffee. But maybe it's time we handled things together. What do you say we make these Saturday morning breakfasts a tradition? Harold nodded, feeling lighter than he had in months. Sometimes, he reflected, the battles worth fighting weren't the ones you chose, but the ones that chose you. And sometimes, just sometimes, backup arrived exactly when you needed it most. Outside, Tank sat in his truck, staring at the diner through tears he didn't understand, wondering when he'd lost his way so completely. Inside, a father and son began, rebuilding bridges over coffee and shared respect, proving that honor, like love, transcends generations.